Right, we are at 2 minutes past, so I think we will start there. There might be some others who kind of continue to join us as we start. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this talk today on event safety, managing risk and insurance issues. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David Mayer. I'm a partner in the large loss and complex claims section of Forbes's insurance department. Some of you may have seen me speak on various subjects before, may have even seen me speak on this particular one before. This is something that we deal with regularly in my team. So hopefully there should be something for everybody in here. I'm going to talk about general risk and insurance issues across events, all kinds of events really. There's going to be a bit about Martin's Law in there, but I do separate talks on that. So we'll kind of go into the bare bones of that, but without a huge amount of detail. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. This has been recorded. For anybody who wants the recording afterwards or a copy of the slides, we can send those to you. I think we'll probably send you a link to the video anyway, to the delegate list or the attendance list, as a matter of course. But if you don't get it for whatever reason, let me know and I'll speak to our marketing team and we will get them sent out to you. So what I'm going to do now is I will share the slides. We're not expecting any fire drills today, mainly because I'm doing this from home. And if there's a fire drill, you won't hear an alarm. You'll just see me in a cartoon puff of smoke go flying out the door, and you won't see me for 10 minutes. So that's what's happened if I just suddenly disappear. Okay, let's share the slides. Okay, hopefully that now should show you the slides. Can everybody see those? Hopefully you can. Okay, brilliant. Thank you for confirming. Right, okay. Okay, so event liabilities. Let's take this right back to start with. Why does safety actually matter? It seems quite an obvious question. Clearly, preventing injury or harm should be the top of any event organizer's agenda, but it's quite easy to get caught up, I think, in the nuances of liability and forget the bigger picture. I mean, first and foremost, there's a moral obligation to keep people safe. If you're going to invite them to attend something from which you profit, an event from which you profit in particular in some way, then there is a duty on you as an event organizer, if you are an event organizer or somebody involved in that, to do that properly and to abide by your legal obligations. And I think it's probably quite often forgotten that people don't need to attend these things. You know, I mean, people attend voluntarily. And if you're going to go to the lengths of inviting people to it, to do the organization, and to let people go, then it is only right that, for want of a better word, you've got your shit together. So that's what people expect of you. Event organizers in particular as well, but also the people who are involved are also the experts. They're trusted to design and organize an event which satisfies the basic requirements of keeping people safe. And causing harm or even just the threat of harm reduces the public's trust in organizations, in attending future events. It exposes individuals and businesses to legal risk of prosecution. For example, directors and safety professionals and other people can be personally prosecuted for breaches of health and safety legislation. And then there's, civil litigation, personal injury claims, corporate fines, for example. Corporate fines are often not covered by insurance policies. So there's a direct financial risk to the business. And then there's also a financial risk from reduced numbers, reputational harm, and things like that. It's difficult to successfully run future events if there's been an incident at a previous one, which has damaged reputation. And the kind of liabilities that we're looking at then are those that are on the screen. We're talking about general public liability, personal injury, property damage, where something goes wrong and causes a loss to somebody else of some description. Employer's liability, personal injury, usually, but some kind of loss to somebody who's working for you. And that, of course, can include temporary workers or people who are being paid cash in hand. You don't necessarily have to have a full employment relationship with you as such, and that's often the way with events. Professional liability, the event doesn't go ahead for some reason. People are looking to the events manager for recovery of some of their outlay, say, for example. I went to an event last weekend, actually. I won't name the event, but I was speaking to one of the exhibitors there who had paid a lot of money to be there. And they were asking me for some advice, as is sometimes the way when you're out at a weekend. They wanted some advice about the fact that they had been basically misled. It was a misrepresentation, I suppose, into the amount of footfall that would be present or is likely to be present. And they felt that the amount that they paid to exhibit wasn't really commensurate with what their expectations were. So there's elements of that involved in events as well. And then cancellation, of course, either whether that be through adverse events or some kind of other incident which prevents it from going ahead. Establishing liability in these kind of cases can be really quite difficult because we need to work out who owes a duty of care, and everybody owes everybody else a duty of care to some extent, at least. And if you take it upon yourself to provide a service, then you have to do that to a reasonably competent standard. People who've seen me speak before on this subject might know this example that I give of a case that I dealt with. But I dealt with a case where a pub landlord had cleared a path to his door in deep snow because he wanted people to be able to get to his pub, of course, but to keep people safe. And he cleared the snow, but in doing so, left the path behind, and then the path froze over and became icy, and somebody slipped and suffered a really serious injury. And the point in that case was that if he'd actually done absolutely nothing and let people walk through the snow, then walking through snow, whilst a little bit difficult or more difficult than normal walking, isn't necessarily particularly unsafe, whereas walking on an icy path is far less safe. So he'd actually created a problem that didn't exist before with completely good intention. And really, it was only being nice. But in doing that, he unfortunately created a problem that didn't exist before. So in that kind of case, you would have a situation where somebody perhaps wouldn't be able to claim who slipped on snow because of not necessarily a duty to clear snow. It's a weather event, it's something that you can't prevent from happening. If you actively accept a task or a duty to do something, then it is your duty to do that to a reasonably competent standard. And it's taking on that task, whether you need to or whether you don't, that then creates that liability situation. And that duty is owed to anybody who might be affected by your undertaking. And this can be very complicated when you've got multiple levels. Something that's often banded around is where everyone is responsible, no one is. And that really reflects the fact that if you've got an event with, I don't know, 100 different exhibitors or contractors involved, each of whom have got their own duty, their duty to other people, to each other, to the event, then it can be very difficult to unpick that. And everybody will effectively try and deflect attention away from them and blame somebody else. And working out who owes what duty is actually a really difficult thing to do in those kind of situations. I mean, who are we talking about who could be responsible? So, for example, you've got the landowner themselves. The approach that's often taken in these kind of situations for events is that the landowner owns the land and says, look, I'm willing to let this out to you or hire it out to you, and you can use it in the way that you want to use it. But basically, this is your event and you should make sure that it's safe, and you should do whatever you need to do to keep people safe. And that's a perfectly reasonable approach. But it's not quite as simple as that. You do remain the landowner, and you still retain a responsibility, at least to some extent. So you can't just devolve that responsibility and escape entirely. It's your land. You're the one who knows the most about it. And you've got to satisfy yourself that it's suitable land for whatever reason. So we see a lot of cases involving, for example, local authorities hiring out recreational areas and parks and things for use for sports, football, things like that. Sometimes, but not always, a local authority will mow the pitches and paint the lines and do all those kind of different things that are consistent with land ownership. And where they do that, or just being the landowner, means that they still have that responsibility for the land, they're still responsible for the fabric of it itself, and also for the fact that they have a superior knowledge about the land compared to anyone else. And you've got to remember the people who hire from a landowner as well don't necessarily have any legal obligation or duty to do anything with the land at all. In fact, if they wanted to change the land in some way to improve it, then they'd actually probably be prevented from doing that without authority from the landowner. So when you look at it kind of like that, you can see that there's a retention of responsibility from the landowner, and that doesn't disappear just because an event is being organized on that land by somebody else. Now, yes, okay, the event organizer is the coordinator. They've probably got overall responsibility in most situations. They're the ones bringing together the other business entities and people to an event. But for instance, if you have an event on a park and people are falling in holes or potholes or that kind of thing, can an events organizer be expected to know everything about the land that they are holding the event on when it's not their land and they may have never been there before? Yes, they've got to visit and make sure it's suitable for their purposes, but in the end, the actual kind of fabric of the land remains the responsibility of the landowner. The event organizer, whilst having overall responsibility, does have various different businesses there usually, and they are entitled to rely upon an assumption that the businesses who are going to be there are going to be reasonably skilled and competent. And in fact, they do have a duty to be reasonably skilled and competent. If you think about a construction situation, for instance, when you have a construction site, you'll have a principal contractor, and that's a bit like the event organizer. But they don't do everything. They will contract or even subcontract to other trades, electricians, groundsmen, whoever else it may be, who are the specialists, and it's up to the principal contractor to make sure that they hire somebody who they think has got the requisite skills. But in the end, they're entitled to rely upon the assumption that somebody who holds themselves out as being, for example, a professional electrician has the skills to be able to do that properly. Those businesses who are at events may also use subcontractors themselves, and they may have their own liability for the work that they are carrying out. And then there's the individuals who are kind of down at the bottom of the hierarchy. The sole traders, maybe people who are attending have their own responsibilities as well to keep themselves as safe as reasonably practicable. So there's this kind of like differential layer of or hierarchy of people involved in events, which all of who will have a kind of interacting duty to each other. I'm going to just give you a couple of case examples, or a few case examples of some quite sad cases, really, most of them, for events that, so for injuries that have occurred in events or other kind of large scale events that have occurred at public arenas. Starting with the Summer Grant case, a really sad one, a young child, 7 years old, who was on a bouncy castle, which is pictured there in a park that she was playing in, Hollowtown Park, when the gust of wind took the inflatable and sent it across the park. 300 meters it traveled in total. And the owners of the inflatable were both found guilty of gross negligence, manslaughter, and imprisoned. And it was caused by a failure to properly anchor the inflatable to the ground, essentially. The instructions for how to properly set the inflatable up had been destroyed in a fire about a year beforehand. And when the owners were sentenced, the judge, Mr. Justice Graham, commented that he couldn't believe it wasn't normal practice for wind monitoring equipment to be used at these events, and suggested that they should be. And the judge was quite astounded by that. And yet it's although it's become more common practice over time, certainly in smaller scale events, I haven't seen anybody taking wind direction or wind readings. And he certainly thought that that should be a pretty standard thing for that. And you look at cases like this and work out the kind of, again, this hierarchy of responsibility. So who would have been responsible for considering weather conditions and what guidance should be given? Well, the owners of the apparatus are the specialists. They're the ones who are going from event to event and holding themselves out to be specialists, inviting people to use it. It's their equipment. They should know how to set it up properly and how to run it safely. But there are certain things that they may not know. For example, like the area that it's in. Is it an area that's particularly subject to adverse wind conditions on a regular basis? Is it a very open park that is very exposed and therefore does have serious problems with adverse weather quite regularly? And is that something that either the local authority or the landowner or anybody else involved, any of the other stakeholders, might have some superior knowledge about, that they may be able to assist with? And again, remember, in this case, this was not a storm or some kind of unprecedented event. This was just a gust of wind. So I often see in risk assessments that people address their minds to the possibility of adverse weather, but it's usually the extremes we're looking at. What if there was a hurricane or floods or those kind of things? It's the extreme things we look at, but really we need to be looking at what have we got on our land, who are we inviting to be here, what are they going to be doing, how does it work, and is the land itself suitable for that purpose that we're inviting people to be there? And that might be a process that the landowner goes through, that the event organizer goes through, if it's somebody different, or that they do in conjunction with each other. And again, those considerations can't just be outsourced. You can't just say, we're going to allow you to come to our land or come to our event, and we're just going to rely on you to do what you're meant to be doing and to do it properly. There has to be some kind of coordination and discussion about that. It is right, in the end, the person who's actually running the apparatus is the expert in the end, and you're entitled to rely upon their expertise and to do things properly. But at the same time, the consideration has to be given and the communication with them to make sure that all the potential risks are properly assessed and monitored and mitigated against. Big Beach Boutique 2. This was a Fatboy Slim concert a long time ago now. It was in 2002 in Brighton. There'd been a Big Beach Boutique 1 where there'd been around 40,000 visitors. So the police expected about 60,000 to this one. And yet in the end, there were around 250,000 people, actually doubled the entire population of Brighton and Hove with all the visitors. And there were huge issues with crowd control and security. Emergency services became overwhelmed very quickly and struggled to cope. And the resultant crushing from all the people who were attending injured 100 people. And there's actually a fatality from a fall from railings as well. Roads were completely gridlocked. People were queuing 10 miles north of the city to get in. Coastal roads were blocked. And that caused problems with emergency with emergency services, because it wasn't just getting to the concert that was the issue, although that was a big issue, but it was also getting to other places around and about the venue. So there's the knock-on effect from round and about, which is something that comes into Martyn's Law for those of you who have been reading into that. Emergency exit routes were blocked. There was crowd density problems, of course, and people were climbing onto lighting rigs to try and escape the crowds, which is where the fatality occurred. Now, they actually had people specifically employed to monitor crowd density at this event, and that is something I think that probably prevented anything more serious happening, although it's serious enough. But it's still a good example, and I wanted to include it because it illustrates quite well how the dynamics of crowd control mean different things to different people. When you speak to the police officers involved, for example, they considered it quite a traumatic experience. They thought the crowd was hostile and disorderly and dangerous and out of control. But this was a rave, for want of a better word, a clubbing scenario. And people who are au fait with that kind of culture know that it's generally a friendly vibe in most occasions. And the people themselves, or the crowds themselves, weren't necessarily that concerned, except about the sheer number of people, of course. And this is something that I think has to be a consideration. It's knowing your event well. If you treat them as a tick box exercise, where you are just going through the same process each time, then you're never going to properly assess the risks of each particular one. This was described as the UK's Woodstock moment. But would it have been different if this was a garage music event or R&B or heavy metal? For those of you who know the Preston Rockprest Festival in Moore Park, for example, that attracts a very different crowd than any of the Radio 1, Radio 2 events that are in the same park. So it's knowing who's going to be there and how they're going to be using the event has to have consideration as part of the risk assessment process. A couple of other kind of slightly different ones now. Some of you will know about the Ed Bilby case. He collapsed in the ring after a boxing event in 2017. Turned out later on that he'd had a congenital heart problem that nobody knew about. But the concern there was about the liaison between the organizer and the stakeholders involved. And there was some criticism from the coroner that there were no defibrillators available at the events, which has actually led now to there being defibrillators kind of a standard at these kind of events. It was actually accepted by expert evidence that it would have made no difference anyway. He couldn't have been revived by a defibrillator in this particular example, but the coroner was quite shocked that that wasn't a standard piece of equipment ringside, but nobody had ever considered that to be, I suppose, a risk really beforehand, and that's obviously clearly changed now. Very similar one, Dominic Chapman, a charity white collar boxing match in April 2022. Another death in the ring, this time from a blow to the head. Questions there about whether there should have been a qualified doctor ringside rather than a paramedic. And there's questions over where treatment was provided, that there was no specific treatment area, just a kind of backstage area that was quite dimly lit. I mean, these are quite evocative case examples, because these are ones where you've got very young people who have passed far too early, devastation with the family, and they're going to ask questions, and they're going to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb to try and work out exactly what happened. And it's only natural that there's going to be criticism, even sometimes unfounded criticism, against the various different people involved. And here again, there was it came an issue about the liaison between the organizer and stakeholders, because the setup of the event involved an event organizer, but then the actual running of the day of the event was kind of subcontracted to a franchisee, and then they had people that were arranged who were doing various different things on the day from the venue, and security where it was a separate company. So it's trying to unpick who was responsible for what. Last example I'm going to give, Detonate, Halloween 2016. The festival was cancelled completely and cleared by the police because of crowd safety fears. People were queuing for almost an hour to get in some of the music tents, pushing and shoving. It was clearly becoming quite a risky event, and the event organizers were pursued with criminal charges, health and safety violations, and prosecuted in the Crown Court. It was eventually discontinued in the end by the CPS. And actually, interestingly, in that case, it was discontinued because the CPS noted that the organisers had followed advice from the local authorities' safety advisory group, and they thought that was kind of quite persuasive evidence that actually they'd done all they could to try and reduce the risk. And I'll mention that briefly in a minute as well. What are responsibilities for the organizer? Well, the list of some of the responsibilities are on the slide there. We have to identify, assess, control, monitor, and review the risk. And that might mean carrying out pre-event site inspections. We've got to keep a risk register, have detailed event management plans. There should be a post-event evaluation as well, and we should be noting any lessons learned. And record keeping really is one of those things, I would say, which we see time and time again is a failing in some of these situations, because sometimes when an event, and of course this doesn't have to be a large scale event, this just might be a meeting of some kind, for instance, and when they've happened for a long period of time in particular, and things are done in a certain way, sometimes you speak to people and they can't really remember how they ended up doing it that way or why, but they just do it that way, and they've always done it that way. And that's not going to be good enough when it comes to an investigation or a prosecution or a civil claim, because we need things that are written down. We need to know where they came from. And if you've not got a proper risk assessment, say, for example, or method statement or whatever else you may need, then it's not going to wash with a judge to say, yeah, but we did assess the risks. We always do as a matter of course. The judge is going to want to see a risk assessment. And in fact, some of the legislation, Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act, for instance, specifically requires you to assess the risk. And proving that you have addressed your mind to it and have addressed the risk properly in a situation where you've got nothing to show for it is going to be pretty difficult in a lot of cases. Common risks we are dealing with are on the slide there, and effective assessment of risk is of prime importance. We're looking at working at height. Crowd management is a big one. Noise, a bit less common, but noise and disruption to local community does need to be assessed. How are people going to get in and out? How are they contained with barriers? And if they are contained with barriers, how do they get out quickly if they need to get out quickly? Security, violence incidents, thefts are a common problem at events, as are temporary structures, as we've seen already in the case examples, and whether when apparatus is installed specifically for an event that's going to be taken down again afterwards, it's usually of a bit more of a less robust construction. The contractors who are going to be working there, are they competent enough, and are they being not exactly supervised, but is there any kind of oversight about their work and making sure that it's been done properly? And an increasingly common one as well is cybersecurity, ticketing systems, retention of people's data, loss of people's data, fraud when it comes to tickets and that kind of thing. We're an increasingly digitized world, and it's not very common to actually have paper tickets anymore. So what steps have been taken to address the risk to people of using that kind of system? As I mentioned, there is certainly a benefit of working with safety advisory groups. The quote on the screen is from the health and safety executives, and it's a pretty decent summary saying that advisory groups provide a forum for discussing and advising on public safety at an event. They aim to help organisers with the planning and management of an event and to encourage cooperation and coordination between all relevant agencies, all things that I've been talking about this morning. They are non-statutory bodies, do not have legal powers or responsibilities, and are not empowered to approve or prohibit events from taking place. Event organisers and others involved in the running of an event retain the principal legal duties for ensuring public safety. So certainly from the HSE's point of view, the event organiser is going to be the one that retains responsibility. But of course, what we're talking about here specifically is safety advisory groups. Safety advisory groups are not a separate legal body. They're made up of various different stakeholders from different agencies, usually emergency services, fire, police, ambulance, local authority, and anyone else who may have a specialist interest. So they don't take on the legal responsibility, but they certainly help coordinate with people to assist with the smooth running of an event, and it's a very useful resource. They act as a single point of contact. So it makes the logistics of the organization easier. They assist with the safe planning, provide guidance, minimize risk, and help impose any restrictions that should be in place. But they, as I've said, and as mentioned by the HSE, they're not an advisory body as such, in that they aren't there to give expert advice, which could leave them open to legal liability or responsibility, and they don't have their own legal entity to pursue. They're not an enforcement body either, nor do they actually plan the event. They're not there to actively get involved in it as such, but just to kind of steer the way towards making sure that the event is safe. This is a diagram produced by the Emergency Planning College, which sets out the factors that can influence how safety advisory group protocols are run. I'm not going to go through this because I mean, I do a separate talk on that anyway. It's not of direct relevance to this particular talk. I've included it because it's a useful diagram, and it will be on your slides when they come through to you. Okay, so that's the general requirements, the risks that we might be facing. Just moving on to insurance now. Unbelievably, there's still no requirement for PL insurance in most situations. Most people have it, of course, and most people insist on other entities having it who are taking part in events, but there's no standardized requirement for it. You can also get specific event insurance. Hiscox, Beazley, and people like that do specific event cover for events of different sizes and types, etc. It does tend to be more of a focus on kind of cancellation cover and that kind of thing, but you certainly can get it. But you do have to be careful of the fine print, really, particularly the indemnity limits. Some standard policies have £1 to £2 million worth of cover, but you can quite quickly get above that in a civil claim for damages, which I'll kind of demonstrate in a second. But if the value of the claim exceeds the indemnity limit, then in that situation, only the company or the entity involved, only their financial resources are left to go against, and it will be the company's responsibility to make up the extra. There are policies as well which exclude from cover situations where there's been a failure to take reasonable precautions. Bit of a weird thing, insurance, because by definition, you take insurance to cover you and to pay out on your behalf for situations where something's gone wrong. And for something to have gone wrong, normally you have to have done something wrong and to be sued in the first place. So you're buying cover for your own mistakes in some kind of way. But then there becomes a point where your failings can be so bad that in actual fact that excludes you from cover completely. So committing criminal offences, for example, can be something that excludes you from cover. £5 million cover is often requested for events, but you need to consider in each situation whether that is going to be suitable or not. It can't really be a one size fits all for each event. In smaller local events, for instance, where the risks might be less, but they might not be, a lower amount of cover might be justified, but you only need one claim, one valuable claim, to exceed the limit, and that can have catastrophic effects. But that does need to be balanced with attracting people to the event in the first place. People who are going to exhibit or run apparatus or whatever it is that they're doing at the event might be put off if there's an extreme amount of insurance cover required, which is prohibitively expensive. It can get pretty expensive, personal injury claims. For those of you who aren't kind of directly involved in them, the injury part of it, the pain, suffering, and loss of amenity, is often actually relatively modest. Certainly in England and Wales, you have to have a really serious injury or some kind of serious PTSD or lost a limb or something to be getting kind of over £100,000. None of the huge penalty payouts that are awarded in America, but lost earnings and lost pension entitlement, etc., those kind of things can often be the most valuable. And if you take somebody who suffers an injury at an event, and you take somebody else who suffers exactly the same injury, but they're two different people, they will be affected in different ways. So if one of them, I don't know, works part-time at Tesco's, say, for example, and earns whatever, £15,000 a year, then even if they have a very serious injury, which leaves them off work for a long period of time, then their lost earnings aren't going to be particularly valuable comparatively. But if you have exactly the same person who's the CEO of a major corporation earning £500,000 a year, then you can see very quickly you're looking at very different sums of money, and the knock-on effect of that with pension entitlement, etc. Care and assistance is going to be different. If you are somebody who lives upstairs in a one-bedroom flat and you break both your legs in an accident, that's going to cause you very different problems than somebody who lives in a mansion who already has staff doing all their cooking and cleaning for them, for instance. So, the effects are personal and unique, and it's those that make the difference to the value. Sometimes properties need to be adapted, and there are heads of loss, such as loss of opportunity on the open labour market, and that is where you may find yourself out of work in the future, even though you're still at work now, despite your injury. And if you were on the open labour market, you would struggle to get a similar job because of the restrictions caused by your injury. And that can be anything up to valued anything up to, say, 2 years worth of your annual earnings. So again, if you take that CEO at £500,000 a year, then that's £1 million of damages right there. So you're not going to be pre-assessing these before events, clearly, but it's important to know that these cases can get quite valuable in certain situations, and the risk is not unheard of. You can have a local event with not a huge amount of people there, where someone suffers a really serious injury that is extremely valuable, and yet you can have huge events with 80,000 people present where nobody suffers any kind of serious injury at all. So it's not directly relevant to the size of the event, or it's not directly proportional to the size of the event. There are things you can do to help yourself in organizing events, certainly in your contractual documentation. I think most of you will probably already know, certainly those who deal with the claims and liability side of things, that waivers to waive against liability for personal injury, for instance, or negligence have no lawful force and can't be enforced. So you can't exclude your liability for negligence. But that does not mean that they have no evidential significance. And if somebody has signed a document which says these are the risks, this is what could happen, and they sign it anyway, and then they go into it, then certainly that can be useful in a subsequent litigation to show that actually they knew what the risks were. And in fact, a lot of these cases, people are saying, well, I didn't know, I wasn't told, there were no signs, there was no this, etc., etc. So they are certainly useful to have. And of course, you can still have indemnities within your contractual documentation, certainly with other businesses who are involved. So event organizers really should be looking at having indemnities with the people who are exhibiting or who they've invited to the event, saying if there's something, if I get sued because of something that you've done whilst in my event, then you've got to indemnify me. In other words, you've got to pay out on my behalf as a result. And there's some argument about whether they can be enforced or whether they're reasonable or not, but certainly business to business, the basic position is that they will be enforceable, and it puts you in a better position for the future should you should anything like that happen. So moving now to Martin's laws, it'd be something that I'm sure has been on a lot of your radars in recent times. The Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill has now come into effect from April, although there is a 24-month implementation period, so the government's given us a period of time to implement what we need to do to comply. And of course, named after, well, the Martin's Law, as we call it, is named after Martin Fett, one of the 22 people killed in the Manchester Arena attack in 2017. And the idea of it is to create a culture of preventative preparation and response to large-scale security risks, to improve protective security and organizational preparedness. And the idea is we're looking at events or premises which are open to the public, which have specified purposes that are in the Act itself, things such as retail or whatever. It covers a lot of different scenarios, and certainly where there's access to the public to buildings and land or events, many will be covered by this law. It creates a kind of a tiered system, a standard duty and an enhanced duty. Standard duty you get where you can reasonably expect 200 or more individuals to be present at the same time, up to 799 people. And then when you get to that 800 level, then it gets to the enhanced tier. The basic tier, the standard tier, requires it's an enhanced risk assessment in effect. It requires you to have procedures and policies in place which deal with specific things in the event of a terrorist attack, and it's things like evacuation, what they call evacuation, moving people to different places, and that kind of thing. It can be complied with basically by having the right documentation in place and assessing the risk properly. And monitoring that over a period of time. In the enhanced section, there's an increased duty. That duty then moves to actively trying to prevent the to take actions to reduce the risk of an attack, and if so, it's physical harm. The standard tier is about reducing physical harm to individuals, or the risk of physical harm to individuals. The enhanced tier is about property and individuals, but preventing it from occurring in the first place. So it has a much more stringent duty, things like active monitoring, for instance. It is all subject to reasonable practicability. So it's, what is within budgetary constraints, what would be considered reasonable to spend for an organization, depending on their size and attributes and etc. What the risk is. and it applies to premises and events, but it's important to know that it also consideration has to be given for the local area. So it's not just the impact on a building or an event, but it's also on the what impact it can have on the local area. So I mentioned the Brighton Hove issue before, and I said that it caused an impact in the local area with emergency services and that kind of thing. So I'm just looking at the Q&As as I'm talking. We will have time for Q&As at the end, but yeah, well, I'll deal with the questions at the end unless there's something particularly present. I think that needs, because we've got a few questions that were sent in before as well. I'll just answer this one, I suppose, whilst we're here. What does the E stand for in the SAG? It depends on where you are from, what authority, etc. But some people call it Events Safety Advisory Group. Some just call it Safety Advisory Group. So that's where that comes from, to answer that question. Yeah, there's one that's a little bit more involved, which I'll come back to in a minute, just at the end, if that's okay. We do have a couple of things in the chats as well. I should just check that and make sure. Yes, okay. Yes, I've seen the question. Thanks, Hannah. Temporary events as well are included within this, so it doesn't have to be something that's regular or always at the same place. Temporary events are covered as well. What are the risks? Sometimes people say to me, well, it's okay saying we need to assess the risk, but we're risk of what are we looking at? And it's a good point. ISIS or Daesh still accounts for around 2 out of 3 of all terrorist plots. But there was a kind of change in shift from about 2017. There became a lot more self-initiated attacks, as they call them, the kind of lone wolf type attack, far less sophisticated, less planning, less coordinated, but more of them and much more difficult to detect. There's a threat from kind of right-wing groups, certainly in certain countries, and there's an increasing risk of that as well. That's something that's increased in recent years, as has the threat of technological attack. It's not just terrorism, isn't necessarily just about those kind of very visceral, visual attacks. It's also about things that happen in the background, and there are threats from people like the Chinese Communist Party who spend a long time trying to tap into the system to obtain information and disrupt things. And local authorities in particular hold huge amounts of data, but so do event organizers. As of earlier this year, there were 800 live ongoing investigations in relation to terrorism. 43 late-stage attacks have been disrupted since 2017. So that was 43 terrorist events that would have happened but were prevented. And there were 219 terrorism-related arrests in 2023 alone. There are various duties on particularly local authorities. I put this bit in because some of you, I know quite a few of you here actually are from local authorities, so that will be of interest to you. And it's worth looking at the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act and the various different strategies involved, because they impose a burden on local authorities, for example, to try and prevent people from being drawn into terrorism within their communities. So we are, I think, just at a point now, it's 10 to 11, we're finishing at 11, and just bringing it all together now and some time for some Q&As. Event organizers in particular should expect to have overall responsibility and should ensure they discharge their own legal duties fairly and properly, and whilst keeping oversight of other stakeholders and making sure they do too. We need to foster a culture of effective communication. I'm not sure why the N on the communications dropped itself down to the bottom. We'll tidy that up before it gets sent out. But this is about speaking to people involved. This is about liaising with them. you can't expect or just rely upon people knowing what they should be doing, and we should be encouraging open discussion. There should be a forum of being safe to raise questions and issues that can then be dealt with effectively and properly. And we should keep everything integrated, from risk management to insurance to liaising with safety advisory groups. Coordination is key to all this. And finally, as I said before, if it's not written down, it didn't happen effectively. Dynamic on-the-job risk assessments are useful for when something's actually happening, but what is that? I mean, a dynamic risk assessment is just, I'm doing something now, something's gone wrong. And that's fair enough when it happens, when push comes to shove. But in the end, you need to be able to prove the decision-making process that led to that in the first place. And that means having effective processes and procedures involved to assess and mitigate against that risk. And then just some useful resources for you. There's only a few in there. Martin's Law, if you're particularly interested in that. As I said, I do separate talks on that subject. And there are various fact sheets on the UK Gov website itself. There's also Protect UK, which is the kind of National Counter-Terrorism Office's own website. Huge amount of resource on there, down to things like dealing with drone attacks and all sorts of different stuff. So the Purple Guide itself, the Event Guide, which is a subscription thing, and then Health and Safety Executive has its own publications as well, which are very useful, as do most local authorities as well. Okay, so I am just going to look at what we've got now then, questions wise. I'll deal with the questions that we had beforehand and have had during it. So thank you for your question, Martin. As a landowner, if you know your land is being used for unauthorized events and you do nothing to prevent such use, can you be held liable for injuries sustained by attendees? Well, a bit of a nuanced question, that, to be honest, because it really, and at the risk of sounding like a lawyer, it kind of depends on the situation, I would say. There is an Occupiers Liability Act 1984, which deals with trespassers to land. And actually, believe it or not, there is a duty on a landowner to prevent trespassers from becoming injured on your land. Now, it's not the same duty as the Occupiers Liability Act 57, which is the one for lawful visitors to your property. It's worded differently, and I'm not going to go into how it's worded differently because, again, it's quite a difficult subject. But basically, you've got to try and stop people from becoming injured by risks that are on the land itself. So, for example, if you have land with a pond and people might go swimming in it, then that comes with it a certain amount of risk, and you need to assess that risk and decide whether mitigating steps need to be taken to prevent it. It could be putting up signs saying don't swim, it's dangerous to swim. It could be putting a barrier up. It could be various different things. There have been cases where children have broken into substations and really, badly electrocuted themselves and things like that, where the landowner has become liable for it because, say, the fence was broken or down. And the whole purpose of having it was to prevent people from going in, and by failing to maintain that, they became liable. In terms of what an authorized event would be, I mean, I don't know what that is. If, say, for example, you have a, I don't know, a rave, that's being one of these kind of covert raves that kind of get arranged and just set up somewhere in the middle of the night that people get invited to on your land. It depends what, I mean, if you don't know about it at all, there's no way you can take any steps. But if you know about it and you know that it happens regularly, and you've kind of almost accepted it as being inevitable just by over the years and not doing anything, then somebody who gets injured on your land, you could potentially be responsible for it. Although they shouldn't have been there, in the end, you knew that they probably would be, and there was a risk that they might become injured. So it does depend very much on the specific circumstances, but that there is a certain possibility, definitely. So I think that's those two that have been answered. Hopefully that goes enough into those for the time being. There is also another question that we got beforehand, which was, should the fire safety manager be the health and safety manager and terrorism responsible person in the future? I'm assuming we're talking for terrorism about Martin's Law and the requirement for a responsible person. Again, there's no easy answer to that question. Should they all be the same person? Well, they can be, but the real question is, are those people, or is that person appropriately qualified to deal with all those issues? Because you can't just lumber somebody with all those responsibilities when they either have no experience or no training or no knowledge or whatever else it may be. You don't have to be a counterterrorism expert to be the responsible person. You've just got to be the person who has been designated as the one who is going to have oversight of policies and procedures that deal with terrorism for the purposes of Martin's Law. So I think the question we should be asking ourselves is, do we want them all to be the same person? There's some pros to that. There's coordination. The policies can interact with each other. They can be drafted with each other in mind by the same person, and somebody who's assessing the risk of fire to premises is pretty well placed to also know how to get people and evacuate from a building in the event of a terrorist attack, for example. So there's certainly some pros to that, but then that could create an unreasonable burden on someone, and increased workload and increased responsibility, etc. So I think the question is, do we want them to be the same person? Is it reasonable under the circumstances based on the size of the business, I suppose, whether they should be or not? And the last question, just before we finish, is, which I think I have actually covered, to be honest, where public liability actually lies with using a public space, but it's hosted by your company. Does the host have a duty to ensure the land is safe, e.g. via a risk assessment? So I think I've kind of covered that off, but the answer is, well, yes. You can't devolve responsibility to other entities. If you are the landowner, you should be carrying out an assessment of risk of having an event in the first place, and whether the event is in theory suitable, or the land is in theory suitable for an event like that to go ahead. If you are the event organizer, I mean, it depends what you mean by host in the situation, but if you're the event organizer, then obviously you have to assess the risk of the overall risk and the logistics of the event, the setup, layout, who's involved, etc. And then every individual entity that's involved in it should be carrying out their own risk assessment too. So I'm not specifically sure whether that answers your question, because it depends on your definition of host, but I would certainly be saying that I would only consider it safe for everybody who's involved to be carrying out a risk assessment to cover their own backs regardless. And I don't see any reason why you should. I don't see a reason not to carry out a risk assessment, I suppose, is the point. I can't see that we've got any other open questions. The question about the slides being sent out. Yes, Hannah, thank you for answering. They will be sent out. And I think that is it. Have we got anything else in the chat? No. I haven't got anything else in the chat. So I think that means that we can wrap that up. Thank you for joining us. Hope that's been of some benefit to you, and we will send the slides out to you. If you're welcome. Thank you, Nicola. If you are interested in any of these kinds of topics, then we are running this series on all sorts of different things. So check out our website and other social media to see what's coming up. So you can jump on our free webinars. We also do bespoke training. So, if there's something that will be of particular use to your business or organization, then let us know. And we usually either have something we've already delivered, or we can certainly write something for you as well. Thank you for joining. Nice to see you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.